let's talk about Xenos, aliens, little green men, all that good stuff. In the galaxy, there are many, 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 many sentient races, species, whatever you want to call them. Officially, the Empire, the Imperium, has nothing to do with any of them on any kind of diplomatic level. As I said in a previous video, the Imperium is incredibly xenophobic. As far as they're concerned, humanity has a manifest destiny for the galaxy. They are the perfection of sentient life as far as the Imperial Creed is concerned. And while they don't actively war upon every species they encounter, as far as they're concerned, there is no diplomacy with them. There is no place for them. If their interests and the Xenos interests conflict, the Imperium is going to do their best to get rid of the Xenos species. And I'm referring to sentient Xenos life. I'm not talking about if they find an indigenous plant or a, beetle or something on a planet. I'm talking about sentient life forms. They have, over the 10,000 years or so that the Imperium has been in its more or less current form, pushed many species completely to extinction. There are other more vigorous and more populous species that they've not managed to get rid of one way or the other. There are some that they're almost continuously in active war with. There are some which they kind of are willing to look the other way as long as their interests don't conflict. Now, if you've seen the miniature battles game and things like Space Hulk and stuff, you've seen some of this because it's typical classic armies in the miniatures game. There are a lot of alien races that people play. I'm going to talk about some of the major ones of those, but I do want to underscore again that in something like a Dark Heresy game, it's very possible to encounter Xenos species that are unknown as far as those miniatures go. They're not part of those major races. So, but real quick, let's talk about some of the big ones. Okay, first off, let's talk about the orcs. Orcs with a K in 40K, not orcs with a C like in fantasy. They're basically like your fantasy orcs, but in space. They have some spacefaring technology. They use bolt pistols. They have their own versions of the mechs and the vehicles and everything like that. They're big, they're green, they're strong, they're violent. That's orcs. All right, next up are the Eldar. They're basically space elves. They are graceful, tall, willowy, arrogant, ancient, very advanced races. This is one of those cases that the Imperium is kind of willing to leave the Eldar alone to a certain degree if the Eldar leave them alone. That doesn't mean they never come into conflict with one another, but the Imperium is not pursuing an active exterminatus on them because, frankly, the Eldar are very advanced, and even though not incredibly populous, can cause a lot of trouble. There are also the Dark Eldar, which are like the Dark Elves from Warhammer Fantasy. They're cruel, they're vicious, they have their own agendas, mostly having to do with fighting the Eldar, but in terms of their species and stuff, they are essentially Eldar. The other big race, well, there are a couple others, but the next one I want to talk about are the Tyranids. Now, the Tyranids are kind of like Ridley Scott's Alien. It's they're this sort of a hive mind. All they do is they live to consume. They destroy entire worlds by essentially killing everyone on it and consuming all the biomass and leaving it a lifeless husk and then moving on to the next thing. They have no technology in terms of mechanics. Everything is basically a living thing, from their soldiers to their ships to their weapons, which are like part of the creatures. Different creatures have different weapons that are part of their bodies, things like that. Those are the Tyranids. They're very dangerous. They're very hard to kill, very hard to stop. And this is something that a lot of the Imperium's resources are spent on trying to prevent them from, basically destroying worlds as they move along, as their hive fleets move from planet to planet and so forth and so on. There's also within the Tyranid category, there's a subcategory which some people are familiar with from Space Hulk and stuff, and that's called the Gene Stealers. They tend to get treated semi-separately, mostly I think because of the Space Hulk game. I'm going to talk a little bit about those on their own because, like I say, it's sort of a special case. Okay, the Gene Stealers are a subspecies of the Tyranids, and they're sort of an infiltration unit in a sense. What happens is if they get onto a world where there's some other race, they can essentially infect the other race with some of their DNA. And what happens is this host, who is generally, it's like a hypnosis sort of thing, they have no memory that any of this happened, goes about their business, and eventually they will breed. And when they do, they will either sire or give birth to a Gene Stealer hybrid, which is going to have some of the Gene Stealer DNA. And eventually, within the course of a certain amount of time, they're going to produce more just Gene Stealers. But this also allows them to basically, in a sense, recruit troops or people from a host world, whatever species they are, that become part of the Gene Stealer and Tyranid sort of cause and are, subservient to the hive mind. And like I say, this is something that occurs as sort of like both passing on the genetics and mutation and that sort of thing, and eventually you have more and more Gene Stealers, and eventually you have this serious contingent of basically Tyranids on a given planet. And you can even have things where it's like a Gene Stealer cult, where the hybrids are perpetuating the cycle and trying to make more Gene Stealers.
What?
That's what they do. It's a little bit different than the huge hordes of Tyranids that descend on a planet and basically just kill everything and try and consume the biomass. Okay, another one I want to talk about are the Necrons. The Necrons are unbelievably ancient. They're old even by the Eldar standards. Like 100 million years ago, they were flying around the stars and all that sort of stuff. At some point, they made the transference, as it's referred to, from being organic life into sort of this living metal thing. There's a whole mythology behind that. I'm not getting into it. They're kind of like mummies or the undead or something. They look sort of like metal skeletons, kind of like Terminator, that sort of thing. They're very advanced, they're very dangerous. They've only in the last couple hundred years started waking up from in their tomb worlds and starting to go around and start trying to take over worlds and expand their interests after millions and millions of years of essentially being dormant. So they are not as common a foe as, say, the orcs or something like that, but they are a serious one, and probably the kind of thing that's going to be more frequently encountered in a miniatures battle kind of a game than in a Dark Heresy game, although a classic situation that does come up sometimes is the whole, everybody thought this was just some moon, but it turns out it's a tomb world, and son of a gun, there are dormant Necrons on it, but oh my gosh, they're waking up, or something like that. So it is a race that the Inquisition might deal with on occasion, but it's not the most common. So that's Necrons. All right, I saved for last what I consider personally a very interesting situation, but it's not necessarily the most common one you would encounter in the game or even in the miniatures battle game, and that's the Tau, T-A-U. I find them interesting because they're sort of a mirror of humanity in a way. I think it's sort of like if humanity in the 40K universe had taken a different direction. The Tau are a fairly young race. They've only recently discovered things like spaceflight, but they make great leaps forward very quickly, technologically, socially, and everything. They also have this creed about the greater good, which is sort of their religion, the idea that everybody's working for the greater good of everyone else. And they will happily take into their ranks any race, any species, any world that is willing to kind of accept their beliefs and work with them. So in a sense, they're much more open-minded. They're much more progressive thinking in terms of technology, in terms of society. They're much more accepting. So when you look at something like a modern day humanity, like, you know, the United States or something like that, and you look at some of the ideals that some people hold up, the Tau are actually almost more like what we are today than what the Imperium is in the year 40,000, where they're very, you know, closed-minded, xenophobic, stagnant. I mean, there's elements of both, but that's why I find them interesting. It's kind of like, you know, different facets of humanity, and the Tau are one side of that coin. There are actually cases of human worlds that have accepted the Tau and basically become apostate from the Imperium and joined the Tau Empire, and these are, the Imperium do not like these people at all. Big surprise. So again, now they're over on one side. They have their own empire. They're not like scattered all over. They're consolidated. They're expanding in a progressive and methodical fashion. So how likely a given group of PCs in Dark Heresy might be to encounter the Tau really kind of depends on where they are. So that's the Tau. Okay, so in a nutshell, when you're playing Dark Heresy and you're working with the Inquisition, you may or may not be working with what's known as the Ordos Xenos, which is the part of the Inquisition that's mostly concerned about Xenos influence, discovery of new Xenos races, Xenos threats, things like that. So the big ones are things like gene stealer cults, other minor Xenos races that might be you know, having some sort of effect, like possibly messing with some people on some world. There are Xenos cults, where either it's people that just think that this Xenos race is really cool, and they try to ape their ways and possibly open up communication with the Xenos race. Maybe they're feeding a Xenos species intelligence about a world to help with an invasion. These are bad things. The gene stealer cults, which we talked about before. Xenos tech, if people find old Xenos tech and so decide to play with that, that's something that both the Adeptus Mechanicus, which I haven't talked about in a whole lot of detail, but basically they're the guardians of technology, and also the Inquisition would be very interested in, because that's all stuff that's technically forbidden and people shouldn't be messing with it. People trading with Xenos and getting Xenos tech or Xenos goods or whatever, and basically it's almost like aiding and abetting the enemy. These are all the kinds of things that the Ordos Xenos would be concerning themselves with. Now, the other thing I want to mention very briefly is when it comes down to a serious conflict with the Ordos Xenos and some Xenos species, and this gets beyond the scale of where a band of acolytes can just go in with their las guns and auto pistols and just shoot a few cultists. The Ordos Xenos of the Inquisition has what's called a chamber militant to call upon. They have a military arm which they can use. All the Ordos of the Inquisition have this, and we'll talk about those in turn. And the Ordos Xenos' chamber militant are the Death Watch. The Death Watch are a specialized band of Space Marines, which, unlike a regular chapter like the Ultramarines or the Space Wolves or whatever, which they have their own history and everything, the Death Watch is selected from various chapters of the Space Marines. So it's actually an amalgamation. It's sort of like they serve a tour in the Death Watch, and you'll see they wear their black Death Watch armor, but on one shoulder guard they still have their original chapter. So you might see a Death Watch soldier that's all in black with the Death Watch insignia and armor and everything, but they have an Ultramarines shoulder guard, or they have a Space Wolf shoulder guard, or a Blood Angels, or a Dark Angels, or whatever the heck it is. And so you have this thing where they all are basically serving a term or two or whatever, however long, with the Inquisition to help them stamp out Xenos. So in the Ordos Xenos, if you get into a really serious situation, you can call in the Death Watch, and they'll start blowing stuff up. Okay, I've gone on long enough, but that gives you kind of a feel for dealing with the Xenos races in the 40k universe. Next time, we'll talk about the heresy in Dark Heresy, and we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be in the Ordos Hereticus. That's all for now.